All right, I think we're ready to move on to the next talk. Yeah, you ready for some more CSS? Okay. Well, you're going to get some more CSS because we've got Rachel next. I mean, it's the cliche to say this person needs no introduction, but I mean, it's Rachel Andrew, right? You know Rachel Andrew if you've done anything with CSS, particularly with CSS layout, right? I mean, the reason why we're using grid is basically because we got all of Rachel's tutorials and grid by example and all that stuff. Everything to do with layout on the web, we got Rachel to help us do it. Right now, she's at Google. She works on herding the cats at web.dev and everything that gets published there, which is great. You probably know her as the speaker, as an author. She's written 22 books. Those books are, number one, no, I'm not gonna list. And you know, as well as all that stuff, she is a member of the CSS working group, so she is, you know, at the coalface doing this stuff. She could talk about some nitty-gritty CSS stuff that has landed in browsers, and that would be fantastic, but she's going to go further than that. She's going to talk about nitty-gritty CSS layout stuff that doesn't yet exist. We're going further to the future. It's going to be fantastic. Give her a warm welcome, please. Rachel Andrew.
Thank you. That was quite the introduction. It really is fantastic to be here for the 10th CSS Day. I really love how this conference has been a place where we've been able to get as geeky as we want to about CSS, you know, where we can ask tricky questions, present on things that aren't ready to use yet, and get feedback from you all. I think, you know, all of us who love and use and work on CSS really owe the team here a debt of gratitude. So, you know, thank you for being here and supporting this conference. So I do feel like I'm with friends here, but for those who haven't met me, I'm Rachel. I'm a web old-timer. I started building sites in 1996. These days, I'm content lead for Chrome DevRel, so I'm working on web.dev and developer.chrome.com, and also helping to co-lead the Baseline project. I'm a CSS working group member, and you can find my blog at rachelandrew.co.uk. I'm trying to use that a bit more, because, you know, social media got a bit weird, didn't it? So when I was asked to speak at the event this year, I obviously wanted to do something about layout. So I'm going to start by having a look at how my very favorite way of laying out little boxes is getting on in 2024. So while it's CSS Day's 10th birthday, I was looking up some old stuff, and I realized that Grid by Example is also celebrating its 10th birthday this year. I put this together. So the reason I did this was because I was doing talks about Grid before Grid was able to use, and so I sort of put this together to demonstrate it, and I mocked up a lot of the examples initially using absolute positioning so that I could put them on slides. And I've actually been going on about Grid for well over 10 years at this point. Now, one of the first articles I wrote about it, and I'm going to return to the theme of this later, it was in December 2012 on 24 Ways, and it was called Giving Content Priority with CSS Grid Layout. The examples in there are based on the IE10 implementation, which if you'd never used is really interesting to look back at kind of where we came from and see how things evolved. And I spoke here at CSS Day in 2015 about Grid. Now, that talk was memorable for me because I got a lot of feedback in the talks I've been doing about the lack of a gap property for Grid. If you wanted to have gaps between your tracks, you had to use a little skinny column. And I remember, you know, I presented on this at CSS Day, and I remember standing in the other venue at a table with Elika from the CSS working group, discussing how we would, you know, do gap and how important it would be. And so obviously it then ended up in the spec. So that's just kind of one of the collaborations that a conference like this has enabled. Of course, Grid landed in Chrome, Firefox, and Safari at almost the same time. It's been classed as baseline widely available since January 2023. It's very safe to use. I'm sure lots of you are using Grid on your sites. Now, also in that 2015 talk was this slide. At the time I was talking then, subgrid was still part of the level 1 spec, and it was marked at risk. No one had started implementing it. And I was really worried that it was going to go away, and that the lack of subgrid would mean people would flatten out grid layouts. And obviously, we landed grid without subgrid in. And to me, it really was the missing feature of that spec. I felt that we really needed subgrid. And the reason was that Flexbox and Grid dealt with kind of one of the hardest problems in web development, as well as like centering things properly. You don't know how tall things are in the web. I'd spent a long time as a developer for design agencies, and I was always telling designers, look, you don't know how tall things are going to be. Design around it. We can't do anything about lining up your boxes. And so finally, with Flexbox and Grid, we were able to line up boxes. That was great, as long as they were participating in the same formatting context. And that was the thing that subgrid would solve. Would be that we could actually nest things down into grid layouts and line things up in more than the sort of top level. And I think the reason that everyone who talks about subgrid it demonstrates pretty much the same demo, because this set of cards is the perfect example of why we needed subgrid. And so we have our 3 cards here, like everybody's, and I've got balloons on mine because I'm trying to make sure that everyone sort of associates balloons and grid and don't understand why. But here I've got my three cards, and you can see that the captions there don't line up because one of them is taller. And if you highlight the cells there with DevTools, you can see why. They're completely separate things. They're not talking to each other. It's really like the old problem we have with floats. We can't tell one thing to line up to the other. And of course, that's what subgrid solves. We cause each card to span 2 rows of the parent grid, set its grid template rows to subgrid, and now all of the captions are essentially in the same row, and they can respond to each other. Now, subgrid landed in Chrome last. It was in Chrome 1.17 last year. The work to implement that was actually done by the Microsoft Edge team. And so subgrid was also part of Interop 2023 to get it all sort of working really well. So it's now part of Baseline, newly available. So subgrid kind of added a puzzle piece. It fixed the issue of how we line up these things of unknown size when the things are nested inside a grid layout. And it's these puzzle pieces that really interest me. These little things that link up things that we already have in the browser. Every time we fill in one of these pieces, we don't just sort of have its bit of functionality, but quite often we find that we can then use other things that we've got in new ways because this new thing has come in and kind of filled that gap. And of course, then people start using things in new ways and ways that we didn't think about as we were designing them. And then we find that, oh, there's another puzzle piece that we need. Other things come to light. And so I think masonry is kind of one of these puzzle pieces. And I think that one reason that people feel like it should be part of grid is because it seems like something that's missing from grid. And in fact, as soon as I started demonstrating the dense packing mode of Grid Autoflow dense, people started to say, is this masonry? And of course it isn't, because you kind of have to, you're filling gaps in tracks rather than jiggling things around. Masonry is a bit different. Because as well as lining stuff up in 2 dimensions, which is something that we have needed to do and we can now do, we have another problem with things that have unknown height. Because sometimes you don't want a kind of strict griddy grid. You don't want that. You just want to have, say, nice columns, and then things just fit into the columns really nicely. That's a layout thing. We see that in masonry, but there's lots of kind of smaller components that kind of lay out like that. We don't actually need to specify both dimensions. We need to specify one and let things all fit in. Now, Flexbox does this kind of jiggly sizing really well in 1 dimension. When people say to me, should I be using Flex or Grid for this layout? This is typically what I say. Do you have a bunch of randomly sized things that you just want to fit nicely in a line? So you don't have loads of spare space around a little thing or squish a big thing into a tiny box. You just want to chuck the stuff at the browser and it kind of figures it out and it's readable. That's a Flex layout. Or Or do you want to create a set structure and then stick your things into it and they then kind of resize to fit into the gap you've put them in? That's a grid layout. Now, there's obviously subtleties to that. You can do content-based sizing in grid as well as flex, but I think for the majority of cases, that's a really good starting point. Do you want to let the browser sort it out for you, or do you want to kind of put something around a framework that you want things to go into? And I think masonry is the same thing. It's just doing it in a two-dimensional way. So with masonry, you want to set your columns, and then no matter how tall the stuff is, no matter how big the content is, you just want it to fit nicely into those columns. That's a masonry layout. That's not a grid thing, because it's not really a grid. It's kind of closer to a flex thing, but it's really its own thing. You're having a fixed single dimension and then telling the browser just to figure out the other dimension for you. Now, I'm sure many of you have realized that we have two opposing feelings about this, and we have a couple of blog posts written by Jen Simmons and myself. I mean, the two people who've gone on about grid for the longest. So we've got these two different opinions. I'm not going to go on too much about these, and they're linked from my notes, so if you haven't read them before, please do go and have a look at them. Now, I obviously work for Chrome, and the opinion of the Chrome team is that masonry probably shouldn't be part of grid. And, we explain why. And I've touched a bit on the sort of philosophical argument. I don't think it's a grid. It isn't a grid, something that's in one dimension. But actually, who really cares? The concern of the team I work for is kind of more pragmatic than that. It's not based just on whether you think it's a grid, because that's very subjective, and I say probably doesn't matter. I'll talk a little bit about this. The first thing is that grid and masonry are basically opposite in the way that sizing and placement works. So in grid, all the items are placed for layout. With masonry, the items are placed as they are laid out. And this can kind of cause performance problems. Now, you're not going to see those performance problems if you're building a little demo to work, to sort of see how it goes. You're not going to see that. But we know that people make really massive grids, because there used to be a limit on the size of the number of rows in grids. I think it was 100,000 rows. Who's going to need a grid of more than 100,000 rows? Of course they do. And they're going to raise issues, and then we're going to know about it too, and we're going to have to fix that. So this is the thing. We can't, as people defining CSS, say, oh, people will never do that, because they will. Because we don't know with any product how people are going to use it. It's the joy of having a product, is that people take it and they do interesting things. So we don't necessarily know how it's going to be used, and there are definitely some performance issues there. What happens to all of the things that aren't in one layout method or the other? When Flexbox and Grid became part of CSS, people kept telling me how inconsistent they were with what they expected. And the reason people felt that they were inconsistent was because they were inconsistent with block layout. So all of the things that you'd ever learned about CSS were suddenly kind of thrown in the air, and it was behaving differently. And, so people had to relearn. And I think over time, we've spent a lot of time talking about formatting contexts. And we say, right, you're now in a grid formatting context. So some of these things don't behave the way you thought they would. You're in a flex formatting context. So, some of the alignment properties don't work in flex because it's one-dimensional. And I think people have started to understand that. If we bundle masonry into grid, then what happens is we have a whole bunch of stuff where we're saying, yes, you're in a grid formatting context, but also these things don't work. Now, to me, as a teacher of CSS, that seems kind of hard. It seems hard to explain. I like to make my job easier when I'm standing on stage. So that's, one of the reasons why I kind of worry about this. I think a really good question to ask when we're sort of specifying things is, do developers need to understand how we've structured specification to use this? And I don't think they should. I don't think you should have to care about the inner workings of the CSS working group and how we've figured out how to do something to be able to use CSS. And I think by bundling masonry into grid, you'd kind of have to understand a lot of those bits and pieces. As I mentioned, it's the opinion of the Chrome team. We should do this separately, but it's been my opinion since before I was at Chrome. There's initial issues raised about this, and one of my concerns was just that every future thing that we add to Grid, we're going to have to consider masonry. And there's a lot of things that you want us to add to Grid still. We want gap decorations, the ability to target areas of the grid without putting an element in there. The ability to flow multiple things into one grid area and so on. There's all these things, and every time we specify one of those, we're going to have to think, and masonry. And it's not always going to work. So, it's kind of, I want us to fix more of these puzzle pieces, and I don't want us to have to dance around masonry while we're doing it. So that's a kind of little rundown of what we think. Do read the blog posts. As I say, I'll share these slides later. They've got links to them. And there's loads of issues about masonry, all sorts of different bits of it, which will still be valid, I think, whether we do it as Grid or separate to Grid. But there's a sort of developer feedback issue, which sort of sets out a lot of things. There's lots of questions and things. If you're interested in this, that's a good place to go, and also to add your thoughts. There's also a whole bunch of us from the Chrome team around, and people from Safari about, so I'm sure we'd be happy to answer questions and talk about it. And as well, lots of us are now heading off to the CSS working group after this, like some sort of really strange road trip. Where I'm sure we'll be talking about these things. So it's a really good time to share your thoughts as we go. But all that said, I don't want us to implement masonry yet. I would like us to implement masonry, but I would like us to stop and do something else first. Because masonry is an automatic layout method. And automatic layout methods have a big problem. Because if we do this content shuffling thing, if we say to the browser, hey, just lay this out nicely so it looks really nice and balanced and all the pieces look great, it's going to cause a disconnect between the visual order, the way those things are laid out, and the DOM order. And the problem with that, the order that things are in the source is the order they will be read out to you, and is the order that you will tab around them if you use the keyboard to navigate. All of that is tied to the source order, not the layout order, as specified. So typically, if you want your sort of standard Pinterest layout, what you want is you want to set up your columns and you want to lay your items out row-wise. If you want to lay it out by columns, use multicol. You'll get the look of a Pinterest layout, but you'll be tabbing down the columns. So people typically want to go across. That's your kind of standard thing. And even with that simple masonry example, you can end up with unusual ordering. I've added numbers there so you can see the actual order these things are in the source. So even a very, very simple example is going to have an unusual order compared to the source. If you start adding really big things, it gets really weird. The tab order will jump around all over the place. And you can't really control that. That's just going to be whatever it is. Now, this already happens in one place in CSS. It happens with grid autoflow dents. I mentioned that people saw that and thought it was a bit like masonry. This is another automatic layout method. What happens here is the grid will backfill gaps left in an auto-place layout. It moves an item to further down so it can fit in, and then it will put smaller items out of order into the gaps. So obviously this jumping around, you can't control it. As the developer of the page, that's going to be different. It's going to be different at different breakpoints, perhaps. If you've got different numbers of tracks at different breakpoints, this jumping around is completely out of your control. And I've talked about this a lot. And when I started talking about grid and workshopping grid, and I would explain to people, because this reading order thing isn't just a problem for automatic layout, it's a problem with all of grid. Because every time you place something on the grid, if you place it out of source order, you cause this problem. And so we kind of gave people this really cool thing, this fantastic ability, and then said, oh, don't use it, because you'll make a mess. And this is what that article that I mentioned at the start was about. I was like, oh, we can use grid to prioritize content. And no, we can't. And I kind of had to backtrack from that once I realized that this would be a problem. The grid spec, the level 1 spec, tells us that grid placement should not be used as a substitute for correct source ordering, but it doesn't really go into a lot of depth about the problems of this visual and source order disconnect. And since the very early days of CSS, we've talked about separating our content from presentation. It's what the Zen Garden was all about, doing all these different designs with the same source. But in reality, certainly as far as layout is concerned, we've not ever really been able to separate that. Our presentation has to be tied to the source so that we don't cause this problem as people are tabbing around the document and having this odd disconnect. And anyone who can see and maybe getting it read out, it could just seem really odd. People have talked about, as I say, ever since I started teaching grid and started showing this, people would go, oh, yeah, but you can't really do that, can you? You can't change the order at different breakpoints because it'll cause this problem. So I've been writing about this for quite a while. There's a bunch of resources in this blog post that other people wrote about. And specifically, people raised this about masonry when that sort of came up as a thing, as an issue. Very quickly, people started to point out, this is going to cause a problem. What are you going to do about it? Now, I don't know if anyone remembers, but for a short, terrible period, Firefox actually tried to follow the visual order, at least where order was concerned. So it was a bug. We had different things happening in browsers. One browser's following the source and the other's trying to follow the order. They obviously fixed it, but for a little while that was actually happening. And some people in the community said, I think we should probably do this. We should follow the visual, the reading order. So this has been going on for a while. And after a very long time, we might be getting close to a solution. With a property that's currently called reading order items, and it is drafted. I drafted it into the CSS Display 4 specification. It's very much a draft spec, but a prototype is currently being implemented in Chrome. The engineer, Dee, who's working on that, is here, so you can have a chat with her later as well. And so I'm going to show you how this works. It's not something you can try out yet. I've had to mock up the examples, and I'm hoping I've got them right, so that you can just sort of see how this works in order that you can give us feedback and tell us if it solves the sort of problems that you have. So as I say, this isn't quite ready to try it yet, but hopefully fairly soon we'll have something that is in a prototype that you can have a go with. So before I show some of those examples, I'd like to talk about where I started with this and some of the design decisions that went into the draft that we've got. So, as I say, this come up several times, and at the same meeting that the masonry and grid prototype that's in Firefox came up, a bunch of us, the minute we saw it, said, hang on, let's solve this reading order problem first. We were immediately starting to talk about that. And I remember, in the breaks at that CSS working group meeting, a few of us started to chat about, well, how could this be solved? Now, my initial idea and the proposal that I put to the CSS working group was very simple. Let's just allow people to opt into the order things are being laid out. Because we know that in CSS Grid, there's the example of the grid modified order, which is the order that things are laid out if you traverse the grid cells. So could we not just have a flag that says, hey, follow that. Don't follow the source, just follow this order that things are being laid out. Now, it turns out that that's not as straightforward as you would think. It kind of matters what the developer's intention was, and we can't always tell that from the layout. And it turns out there's quite a lot of possibilities as well. There's quite a lot of different things that people might want when they say, follow the layout. And I think actually Flex is harder than Grid. Now, as one example, what do you actually want if you use Flex Direction Row Reverse? Because if you're in a left-to-right language, such as English or Dutch, when you use row reverse, the main start and end get switched, so they run in the opposite direction from the normal text direction. So the items line up at the right, and their flow order goes from the right. Now, if you were using reading order, that might be what you want. You might want things to go from the right to the left. Or you might think, actually, I want the things to line up at the end, but I want the reading order to be the same as normally in English, to go from left to right. So it's really hard for us just to say, follow the visual layout, because we don't actually know what it is that you wanted when you did that. And we needed a way to let the developer set their expectations for reading order. Another kind of design decision here is that we wanted to make sure this is a definite choice on a per component basis. Rather than letting people just go, turn on the visual layout and let everything be a complete mess inside the document and you're going to let the grid decide. We didn't want people to do that. We don't want design tools to do that. In the case of a design tool, this is something that lets you drag things around to make a design using grid. If it used reading order to sort of fix that, that would be non-conformant. That they shouldn't be doing that. They should be going and then updating the HTML to make sure that the source order is a sensible representation of what is on the screen. And the other thing that we're doing to sort of make this possible is scoping it to layout contexts, in particular keeping it out of block layout. Because although in block layout you can kind of mess up the order, you kind of have to do it with absolute positioning. And you probably shouldn't be doing your entire layout with absolute positioning. That's very hard. I remember the days when that was all we had. There's not a lot you can do. Most of the things that you can do with absolute positioning, you could also be doing with grid if you needed to. So we're keeping it scoped to certain layout methods. At the moment, Flexbox and grid. That's what's in the current draft. Obviously, if masonry became a separate thing, it would be possible to specify it also for masonry. So that kind of keeps it nice and clean and keeps it contained. It doesn't let it leak out into block layout, which is a bit scary. So let's have a look at what this proposal will do in practice. Let's say the current name of the property that controls reading order is reading order items. That's added to the element that's the flex or grid container. Now, the default value is normal. And that will do what happens now. So, follow the order of items in the DOM, taking writing mode and direction into account, ignoring the order property, grid placement, or anything else that you might be doing to move things around. So I've got my 3 flex items. In English, I have set them to row reverse, and the tab order starts on the right and moves to the left. So that's following the DOM order. And in all these examples, the words sort of are the order that things are in the DOM. So we're going 1, 2, 3. If I give my flex container a reading order items value of flex visual, the tab order will now follow the visual layout. This means that because we're in a left to right language, the tab order will run from left to right. So the items are still reversed, but the reading order is following the visual order of items in English, which means that the third item in the DOM is tab 2 first, then the second, then the first. If I give that container reading order items value of flex flow, it will return to reading right to left, because that's the flow order. And so we're now back to 1, 2, 3. So far, relatively straightforward. But what happens if we add in the order property? So this is where we start jumbling things up a bit. So we've still got our reversed items, but we're going to add in order as well. Now, if we remove reading order items, or we give it a value of normal, this is where you see that disconnected jumping around, because the order property has changed things visually, but tabbing is still relating to the source order. So the order is going to be 1, 2, 3, despite the fact that's not the order that the things are displayed. So now if we go to reading order items flex visual, we can have a reading order of left to right, but sort of ignoring the fact that the source now is different. So we're taking the order into account and we're displaying it. This is kind of what the Firefox implementation did years ago. And with reading order items flex flow, we go back to the sort of normal direction that you'd expect, but we're still taking order into account, so they're happening in order. So I think this kind of gives you all the possible options there for flex layouts. And obviously this takes the direction into account. It takes writing mode into account. If you have, if your flex items are in a column or column reverse, this all just works in the same way, pretty much as you would expect, either going the visual way or going the way that Flow does. So that's Flexbox. Let's have a look at how this plays out if we're in grid layout. So we have these two places at the moment where we can have this disconnect. The first is with auto placement, the example that I was showing earlier when we've got this dense packing mode. Now this is without the dense packing mode. So here what happens is grid by default will place things and keep things in source order. So when it's come to that big 3 box that's spanning quite a lot of rows and columns, it doesn't fit in the first row, so it moves it to the second row, and then the items go next to it, and that's fine. That's the sort of tab order that you'd expect. Once we do the dense packing mode, grid backfills the gaps. So it finds those gaps, it picks the next small item up, and it pops it in the gap. So this is where we have the problem of things getting disconnected. And obviously with a very big layout with lots of complex different size things, that can get pretty messy. So this is where we want reading order items to sort things out for us. Now we have different keywords for grid, because with grid, there's kind of 2 things we want to do. We want to go by rows, or we want to go by columns. So with our disconnected dense packed layout, we probably want to go by rows there so that the tab order can follow the laid out rows rather than jump around. So we end up there with something like this. So the tab order ends up being 1, 2, 4, 5, 3, 6, 7 as you move across by row and sort of tab between the items. Now, you might want to go by column. You might have something laid out where you'd like to actually follow the columns with your tab order. So perhaps I end up with a dense packed layout like this. The items have been laid out by columns, so Autoflow is laying them out by columns. And again, we're doing this kind of weird jumping across thing based on the order they are in the source. So here I can use reading order items, grid columns, and I get a much nicer kind of experience as I tab around because we're going by column. And that's kind of what you would expect. If you saw that layout, you wouldn't expect to be hopping all over the place. So that's what grid columns would do. And so then the other things that we might want to do with grid is really what I was thinking about in that article I wrote in 2012, is positioning things and maybe changing them at different breakpoints to lay things out so that we can prioritize things in a really good way, no matter what the presentation of the content is. Now, in terms of reading order items, this works in pretty much the same way. You either want to go by rows or you want to go by columns, but you've got a bit more control, at least, when you're working with things that you're laying things out. You're doing that placement, so you can kind of think about it a bit more carefully. So, I mean, grid template areas, obviously trivially easy to create a real mess because you can display things anywhere in that structure and make it very difficult for anyone to navigate around. So use reading order items, and then we say, look, follow the rows in this layout, no matter, what they are in the source. And then we've got a final value for grid. And that's grid order. Now, what this does is it lets you prioritize items with the order property, have everything else work in the same way, so follow the DOM order, so doing normal, basically, unless something has used order, in which case, sort of use that first. So sort of follow the order, otherwise do things as normal. So this example, I've given the second item in the DOM, so that's that top bar, which is number 2. It's the second item in the DOM. I've given that an order of -1, so that's kind of pulled it out. So that's going to get tabbed to first. Everything else is just happening as it is in the source. So that's kind of the proposal. That's what we're sort of hoping to do. That's what is in the sort of the test implementation. I think some of it's behind a runtime flag already. But hopefully, we'll have something that you can play with. There's a few issues on the spec, as you can imagine. I'm sure there will be other things that will come up as we play with this, but I'm just going to introduce the issues that we've got at the moment because, as I say, we're all heading to the CSS working group meeting, and some of these are on the agenda. So if anyone wants to, say something, let us know what you think. That would be really great because then I can sort of add your feedback as I present these items. So, reading order items or reading order. Now, the reason we're using reading order items, and everyone is going to say, but why isn't it just reading order, is because in between my very simple idea and what we've now got, there was a more complicated idea that had a property for the parent and also a property for the children that would, essentially by tying this to order, would let you, by integer, actually specify exactly what the order should be. We think we don't need that, but we kind of left the door open to maybe do that in the future. So that's why this property is reading order items. It's a bit like you've got align self on the children, and then your sort of alignment properties that set all the align self values. Because reading order would obviously would be sort of cleaner and nice and seem nice. So maybe that's something we want to do, is actually change to reading order. And if we ever do the integer thing, come up with a different name for it. So that's in the spec. Should we stay with reading order items, or would people like us to be using reading order? There's a completely different proposal. That's in there. I think this works pretty well, but obviously, the way that we work in CSS is that we obviously want to discuss and make sure that we've thought about different things. So there is a different proposal there, which has been kind of explained. Have a look. If you think that is a better way for things to go, let us know. It'd be really good to sort of have any comments on that. And then we've kind of got all sorts of tricky bits are going to come up. One of those is this. How is reading order items going to work with display contents? I'm not going to dig too much into this now because it gets quite technical, but I think there's some good discussion on the issue. If you want to look at that, there's going to be a bunch of this kind of stuff as we work through this. How do we deal with this on certain things that happen when we do layout? I've explained some very simple cases so far. I'm sure that this will be one issue of many that we need to come up with an answer to. They're not necessarily going to be difficult. They need solving. We need to know how it's going to behave and how we can sort of explain that. There's also been a suggestion that we should use this on tables. Now, to be honest, I'm terrified of the table spec, so I don't really want to look at it. But to be honest, I don't actually know if there's a real use case for this. As has been pointed out, tables have good accessibility support already. If you're doing a data table, that already has good support. The assistive technology knows how to deal with tables and knows what tables are if you've marked them up properly. So maybe there's not really a case for this. But if it's something you know about and you think, hang on, there is a use case, then that would be great to actually talk about that and to add your comments, because obviously we tend to go on sort of use cases. If there's no good use cases for something, we'll not be spending the time doing it. So have a think. I know Adrian Rosselli has commented on this, and he does know a lot about this sort of stuff, and he doesn't think this is a good thing to get into. But yeah, have a look and add your thoughts if you think there's something that we're missing there. And of course, masonry. At the start of this talk, should masonry be part of grid or not? Whatever happens, wherever masonry ends up, this is definitely something that we should specify for it. So there's not an issue at the moment, but whatever happens with masonry, we want this to happen, and I would like it to happen simultaneously. I would like it that if we ship masonry in whatever form, it comes with reading order, so that we don't ship something which just causes a mess. That's really what I care about the most about the whole masonry thing, is that we don't give people something and then say, no, don't use it, because that's ridiculous. So let's not do that. So that's it. What I like about this is I've been able to explain it to you, hopefully in a relatively clear way, within a few slides. It's not too complicated. I think it makes sense. I think the flex stuff needs a bit of wrapping your head around, because flex does. It can be a bit tricky. But I think that once you can actually play with this, it should make quite a lot of sense. It's reasonably easy to use, but you have to do it intentionally. There's no box sizing like switch that just lets you say, my content is just all junk, just tab around it, according to the layout, which you don't want to do that. So I think, being intentional about source order really matters. That is always going to be the basis of an accessible document, is that you have a good source for, the most common presentation, perhaps, of the content. I think that's really how we're going to work, We'll create a solid document, and then we'll do small tweaks for different breakpoints and what have you, and we'll use reading order items to sort of, do those tweaks and make sure they work well for everybody. Let you shift an item or two out of the source order in order to prioritize it. Which to say, that brings us right back to that 2012 article that I mentioned at the start of the talk. That was an approach I had to backpedal from. I was really excited about Grid because my background is really as a content management system developer. And so at the time, I had a CMS. That was my product. And I was really excited about this ability to perhaps let people in the CMS say, not make layouts, but just to say this content should have priority. And then be able to use CSS to actually give it priority in whatever way made sense for the presentation of the content. I thought that was a really exciting idea, because I think getting away from, giving people a CMS and telling them to design pages, that's never a good idea. What you want to do is say, here, which bits are most important, and then at the different kinds of layouts you have, being able to prioritize it. We've never really got to a point where we can do that because of these accessibility problems, and I think this is something that we could be looking at in future. I think reading order is very much one of these missing pieces. It will unlock new possibilities. It will let you do stuff with Grid that exists in Grid that we currently have to tell you not to do. It will ensure that whatever form masonry takes, we can do it in an accessible way. So I hope that you're also excited about us fixing this, and that when it comes out, you will test it and you will tell us what problems there are. Because then we can kind of make it really good and to do all those things that we want it to do, and sort of solve this problem. And so once again, thank you to CSS Day and all of those past and present who've taken the time to share ideas here, whether that's from the stage or, in the hallway track. Thank you for playing these very long games with me, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Very clearly explained, as always. Before we get to reading order, masonry. Upstairs, there's a whiteboard where you can add your little post-it note of what's missing from the web, and you can add a +1 if there's something, oh yeah, that's what I need. I don't recall seeing a post-it note with masonry on it. We have better things to be spending our time on.
I spent a long time as a product person. And when you have a product, and I had a content management system, when you have a product, you'll do something. And half of your customers will say, why are you wasting your time on that? And the other half are going, but we really want it, we need it. And I think this is the thing with masonry. There are definitely, we've got surveys and stuff. We obviously, working for a browser, we do ask people things. We don't just go do things and throw them at you. So we know there are a lot of people do want masonry for one reason or another. Not necessarily because everyone wants to recreate the Pinterest layout. As I say, there's lots of smaller things that are masonry-like layouts. But I think, if things don't kind of resonate with you, if you look at it and I never need that layout, that's absolutely fine. It's not like the CSS working group work on one thing and stop all work on everything else, right? I do layout. I don't know very much about color. I can't tell one font from another. So it's but I don't think that it's bad that the CSS working groups sometimes work on color. That's important too. So I think, just because one thing is happening, it doesn't mean that other things aren't. And I think if we are doing something, it is because people want it. We're not making CSS just for a lark.
One of the reasons you were giving why you explained very clearly why you didn't think masonry belonged in Grid. You mentioned performance. Mm-hmm. You might be the boy who cried wolf here, because I remember being told we could never have something like has. and we could never have container queries. And we were told this by the browser makers because it's too hard, performance issues. I think you over-delivered, because I don't believe you now when you say, no, this is too hard.
I think now we've got lots of browser engineers here, so you can definitely come and talk to them about these things, because they're much better than I am at describing this stuff. But I think part of this is, we've rewritten chunks of browsers. So things like the rendering ng work, in Chrome actually unlocked a bunch of stuff. It meant that the browser could do a bunch of stuff that we couldn't do before. But also, I think there's just this thing where, I talk about puzzle pieces, and I think like with container queries, we got containment, which allowed us to do this. It gave us a path. And I think what we see with CSS is that each time we do one of these things, we unlock other possibilities. And some of those are going to be things that we've said we can't do, because suddenly we're going, oh, right, now we can do this. Then that actually does let us do that. And I think that's what this is. I started, as I say, there was no CSS. We built this from nothing. And every time we take a step, we potentially unlock other steps.
Okay, but do you understand why I take it with a pinch of salt when you say?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. We're just making stuff up, really.
There were a couple of people sending in questions. There's an understandable kind of ick with CSS, a presentation language, affecting something like the accessibility tree. I know there are precedents for this, but like Gautier, for example, asks, seeing as this is to do with content layout, shouldn't we be solving this in HTML rather than CSS? In
fact, that's interesting, because we did think that when in that meeting, the CSS working group meeting, where we were talking about this. I remember sitting down with Brian Cardell, and we were talking about this, and we were actually talking about having an attribute in HTML and saying, well, but the problem is then, I think one of the big use cases of this is responsive design, and is turning this stuff on based on the presentation of the content, and that happens in the CSS layer. And I think if we did it we could only do a kind of global switch in HTML. It would be like, basically the idea was, ignore what's in here. It's like this is just like a bag of junk, and we're going to work it out in layout. And as I say, we don't necessarily want that, because I think by doing it in CSS, we say your order is still really important. Get that right, and then maybe move some bits around. And I think it's the right place to do it.
Okay, but in case of conflict, we've had a question from both Sebastian on the live stream and from Tom here in the room. Which wins, reading order items or tab index?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think we need to define each of these things. There's also an explainer which goes into loads of detail, which actually was just put in front of me yesterday by the engineer working on this. But there's lots of detail there about how this will work in HTML, because there are changes needed for the HTML specs to deal with this. So I think I put it in my notes. If I didn't, I will add it to the resources for this talk, so you can have it if you want to know about the sort of implications of HTML and this. That's probably the place to start.
And add just another layer to this. Michael brings up something like we're talking about different ways the developer gets to specify what the right reading order is, but surely the user should have the last say.
I think that by using this in ways that are kind of tweaks to layout, I think that's the key thing, because the sort of situations where this is a problem are typically small, apart from the automatic layout thing, which I think we just need to deal with. The masonry and the dents thing, we just need to deal with that in a sensible way, because what's happening at the moment is terrible. So, but with the stuff where you're moving things around, I think that this is the key thing, is that you must make sure that the source is correct. Because then if the user just wants to ignore that, if there was a way to turn off all of this, then the source would be correct, and it would be a good reading experience. If they just turned off their CSS because they hated everything you'd done, the source would be great. And I think that's the key thing. We need to preserve, and I think that the way this is being designed is really important, that we preserve the requirement to have a solid source order, even if you're using this.
And could you see this idea of CSS affecting, some pretty big accessibility decisions being taken further, like in the area of semantics? Like, it already happens that if I say list style none, that affects the semantics in some browsers. I jump through hoops to make a visually hidden class? Should that be something I should just be able to do in CSS?
Yeah, and I think that, there's certainly suggestions that that sort of stuff does happen. I think, it's something we need to be super careful of doing, because I think that, the ability to make a mess is also, very bundled up in this. I think that's the thing about, coming up with design decisions that, as much as possible, stop people making a mess when we're doing this kind of thing. Being very, very intentional about how it's supposed to work and what it's for, and not going down the lines of, no, it's fine, just turn it on for everything. And and I think that having the separate keywords and things like this, it just makes it, there's enough friction there to allow you to do what you need to do, but not do other weird things, because as I say, we know that people will do other stuff with the things that we design.
Responsive power and responsibility. You'll be able to talk to Rachel during the lunch break. She'll be up there at the Google desk. We're not going to have a break now, so stay where you are. There'll just be a couple of minutes while we switch over the laptops, so talk amongst yourselves. But for now, please join me in thanking Rachel Andrew.
Thank you.